Go to KingLineNutrition.com. 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 I can't say enough. Your guilt-free dreams are coming true. It's 100% plant-based, gluten-free, low-sugar, protein-infused, true to flavor. You can enjoy it raw or baked. What does Andrew even talk about? He's talking about edible cookie dough, and that's at KingLineNutrition.com. They also have keto cookie dough, pancake mix, cookie butters, mud cakes, protein brittles, greens. I'm big into the cookie dough, so I'm going to just talk about that. Anything that you can think of, like a candy bar, a cookie, not popsicles, candy bar, cookie, what did I say? Like a dessert, they have it here. It's gluten-free, low sugar, non-dairy, egg-free, peanut-free, unless you get like the Reese's flavor. But they have so many snickerdoodles, cookie dough. What was that one I saw? Samoa cookies. Ooh, like Girl Scout cookies. They have frosted sugar cookies, classic peanut butter, as I mentioned, fruity crisp. That's right, they have cereal flavors, salted caramel pretzels, and something I really want to say, they have pumpkin cookie dough mix. It's spooky season coming up. It's Halloween season. Get a jar, get a bundle of 6, get a bundle of 4. Or if you don't want cookie dough, try the other ones. Oh, there's even more. Birthday cake, Oreo. What was that? Chocolate chip cookie jar. Fudge brownie, animal crackers. Wow. It's like pink and white animal crackers. And then I'll say one more. Classic cheesecake. There you go. So go to KingLineNutrition.com today. That's KingLineNutrition.com and type in the code Lockhart. That's my last name, LOCKHART, for 15% off. That's Lockhart at KingLineNutrition.com. Let's get to the show. Here we are once again. Football season has started, and I say that because on this episode 6 of that 70s pod, I should say, Brian Lee, my co-host, the 70s savant, I believe the word he used last week, or expert, whatever. Myself and Brian Lee are going to talk about the 1973 Minnesota Vikings. I'm jumping right into it. Brian, first of all, how are you today, though?
I'm fine. It's football season. It's hot and muggy where I am right now in Wisconsin, but temperatures are supposed to start getting cooler tomorrow, which means it's prime football weather, and the NFL season is underway. And today we're going to be talking about my personal favorite team of all time, which was the 1973 Minnesota Vikings.
I'm in Florida right now. I'm also dealing with hot and muggy weather, and it doesn't start getting, it just gets like hard. Like the ground gets a little hard and the air just gets a little hard, but not windy. And that's when it starts transitioning from hurricane weather to like football weather in Florida. But in 1973, what was the weather? What was the first game? Like, why was 1973 such a big pivotal season of you as a Minnesota Vikings fan?
Well, Andrew, like we talked about in a previous show when we talked about the Nerf football a few weeks back, I first started keeping track of pro football in 1972, where I explained to you I was kind of a nerd and I would write down all the scoring from Viking games and the scorecard and who scored in each quarter and all that stuff. And the Vikings weren't very good that year, Andrew. They were 7-7. They only played 14 games back in the 70s, the NFL I'm talking about. And the Vikings were 7-7 and missed the playoffs for the first time in, I think it was 4 years. So coming into 1973, there was certainly more of an interest if the Vikings could improve on their 7-7 record. Many people thought they were getting too old. Possibly. They brought in a rookie running back from, I believe, from the University of Miami, Florida, named Chuck Foreman, who was a receiver in college, but they planned to make him a running back and pump some new life into an aging running game that the Vikings had at the time. But I can specifically remember during training camp in 1973, Andrew, that one of the players, defensive tackle Gary Larson, who wore number 77. He said in an interview he was actually wearing a jersey in training camp that said 140. Now, of course, nobody wears a jersey that says 140, and so they asked him to explain why he was wearing a jersey with the numbers 140 on both sides. And he said, "Well, my normal number is 77, and we were 7-7 as a team in 1972, and this year we're going undefeated. We're going to be 14-0. That's why I'm wearing the jersey number of 140." And so that generated a lot of interest right there. The Vikings went 5-0 in the preseason, and the regular season started on September 16th of 1973 against the mighty Oakland Raiders.
So, you did mention undefeated. We will get to that in a few minutes, I'm sure. So nowadays, I know you read the newspaper, you listen to the radio, you pay attention to stats, pregame and postgame. Were you doing that at a young age, or were you just strictly watching a live game and then waiting until the next week?
Well, like I said, I started that in 1972, where I would write down the scoring, and I might even have that somewhere. I don't know. you know,
Yeah, but
uh,
were you paying attention to like what was happening in the off season, like trades or anything? Like were you almost prepping for the 1973 season?
Well, sure, as much as possible. There was no internet back then, of course, in the 70s. So the only access to information about your favorite football team, or any team for that matter, was watching the 10 o'clock news, watching the sports, or reading the newspaper. I don't remember, Andrew, if my family got a newspaper. I think they did. Um, but I was more not so much a reader as I was a viewer. So I always tried to watch the 10 o'clock news to see what was happening with the Vikings in training camp.
What was the newspaper back then that you would have gotten?
Well, back in the 70s, there was actually um, a newspaper that was delivered in the morning, and that was the St. Paul Pioneer Press. And then in the afternoon, another paper would be delivered called the St. Paul Dispatch. Now, a lot of big cities used to run two newspapers a day, um, but of course that got to be costly, and that ended sometime in the 80s. So I think now the paper is just called the St. Paul Pioneer Press and Dispatch because they actually merged. But I want to answer your question. I would look at and read occasionally the St. Paul Dispatch because that one came in the afternoon, and that's what my parents subscribed to.
So the NFL preseason, as you mentioned, was from August 11th to September 8th, and they went 5-0. They defeated the Steelers, the Chiefs, the Raiders, the Dolphins, and the San Diego Chargers. Nowadays, I feel like the preseason is hit or miss. Like if someone wins all their games in the preseason, that doesn't mean anything. But back then, was that like a really big promise that they went 5-0 because of how rough the 1972 season was?
Well, it was and it wasn't. The As you know, the preseason this year that just got done a few weeks back before Labor Day, the starters of just about every team didn't even play in the preseason, and you got like Aaron Rodgers, he didn't play a down for the Packers. Kirk Cousins didn't play. Tom Brady didn't play. None of your starters play in the preseason anymore, Andrew, because they don't want to risk them getting hurt. But back in the 70s, they played. They played. Fran Tarkington played. Maybe not every preseason game, but he played, and it was fun. I think I actually kept track of the preseason stats as well. I can't say that for sure, but I think I did. And you mentioned that they played the Miami Dolphins, who were the undefeated Super Bowl champs from 1972. They went undefeated and won their first Super Bowl against the Redskins. That would have been Super Bowl 7. And and so the Vikings wanted to repeat that feat and go undefeated in 1973. and they played and beat the Dolphins in the preseason. I think the score was 20-17.
Right.
It was a Friday night game in Minneapolis, and people were just excited that even though it was a preseason game, our Minnesota Vikings beat the Miami Dolphins.
So before we dive into the season, did you go to any of these games in '73 live?
No, football tickets. My dad wasn't a huge football fan. I mean, he was kind of a a lukewarm football fan, I guess. I mean, he wouldn't sit and watch a whole game. Um, so buying a ticket and going out to Old Metropolitan Stadium to watch a Viking game wasn't in his wheelhouse. A Twins game was something different because Twins tickets were only $4 in the '70s, where Viking tickets were quite a bit more money. So no, we never went to a Minnesota Viking game.
Is that just because there's so many more baseball games during the season that it's cheaper?
Well, I would imagine so. When you think about it, when there was only a 14 game schedule in 1973, seven of them were home games. So you only have an opportunity to make money in seven games. And, you know, whatever preseason games there might have been, I think they had two or three out of the five. And then they had one playoff game, which we'll be talking about a little bit later in this show. So maybe there's a total of 10 opportunities to make money with a home game in any NFL season.
So I obviously have the list here, and I have the list of like all 14 of the regular season games, and we can sit here and go through the scores, who they played, and everything. But this is about you in 1973, watching and listening on the radio as a kid. So, do you want to start with game one against the Raiders, or is there something that like is it not in order? Is there just something certain that you want to share about your fandom in 1973?
Well, there was a lot of interest in the 1973 season because it was Fran Tarkenton's second year back with the team. He played for the team from 1961
The
to
quarterback.
1966. The quarterback was traded to the Giants, and in 1972, he came back to the Vikings, but he had never ever played in a playoff game, Andrew. And so Fran Tarkenton wanted to get this team to the playoffs. They brought in a receiver named John Gilliam, who was about 170 pounds and just a fleet footed receiver that could break a game open. Chuck Foreman, as I mentioned earlier, was brought in. He was their number one draft pick, and he was rookie of the year that year. And even though he had some nagging injuries from time to time, didn't play every game. When he did play, that guy was dangerous. He could run the football, he could catch the football, which is something that really no Viking running back has had ever done before or since. The Vikings have had some great running backs since the '70s, but they've never had anybody that could catch the ball out of the backfield and make plays like Chuck Foreman. And it's a shame he's not in the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
Okay, so to paint a picture, are you more so watching these games on TV, or do you have to listen on the radio?
Yeah, back then the NFL had a rule, um, and most of the NFC games were on CBS. So as long as a home game was sold out 72 hours prior to kickoff, the the network would televise the game. Well, all the Viking games were sold out um, with season ticket holders, and so we didn't have to worry about not seeing a Viking game because they were all sold out well before the 72-hour deadline, and we could see every Viking game on TV, whether it was home or away. Because you see, Andrew, nowadays you can see home games, you know, whether it's a sellout or not. But back in the '70s, you couldn't see a home game unless it was sold out because the logic was if the game's not sold out, they're not going to show it on TV because they want people to go to the game and pay for a ticket and watch the game live. And unless it's sold out 72 hours ahead of time, you're not going to see that football game.
So you watched it on TV. Paint the picture of like where you were. Is this your living room? Like, do you remember? Like, was it a tradition each day? Did you have something that you wore for good luck, or
I don't remember if I wore anything for good luck. I didn't have a Viking jersey because they weren't readily available like they are nowadays, where you can just go on the internet and buy a jersey of your favorite team from the NFL Shop Zone. That didn't exist back then, and
like
you
at
couldn't
Sears?
find it. What's that?
Sears didn't have them.
Not that I know of. You could order them through a catalog, which I did, but I didn't get a Viking one because at the time I really liked the Buffalo Bills as well, and I was hoping the Vikings would play the Buffalo Bills in the Super Bowl. That didn't happen, but so I had a Buffalo Bills jersey because they were my favorite team from the AFC. But the Vikings were, of course, my favorite team overall. But
So
to answer your question, no, I didn't wear anything special. I just parked myself in front of our black and white TV, and we had just moved into a nice new house in St. Paul on Armstrong Street. I remember the name of the street, and I was a sixth grader at the time, and I was ready to watch the Oakland Raiders, who were always a good team from the AFC back in the late '60s and early '70s, and they had a lead on the Vikings, I believe, at halftime, 16-10. Vikings came back and won the game, and and I was just excited. My brother and I, after the game, went out and played football in the yard. Um, and then we went up to a nearby football field and kicked field goals because there was a goalpost at one end of the field, and so we would go up and kick field goals on Sunday afternoon. That was just a lot of fun after watching the Vikings play.
this is just a quick sidebar because I googled Sears '70s Vikings jersey, and apparently this is the only one that popped up for kids. I'll try to paint the picture. I keep on saying that. It's like a purple lawn sleeve shirt, and it says Vikings on top, and then number 10, which was the quarterback's number, correct?
Right, and so that was not an authentic jersey by
Oh,
any means
not at
because
all.
number one, it was long sleeve. Number two, it didn't say Vikings on
On
a
the
real
back.
NFL jersey. It just has had a number and the player's name on the back, which also that one didn't have. So, and I think you can still get that. If you went into Amazon, you could get a retro jersey like that, but it's not an authentic jersey. Unless that was available, I wouldn't buy
So I do have two. I have a question and then kind of have like a quiz, real quick. When I was in fifth grade, it was really big. Vikings versus Packers. We would waste like 40 minutes of class time just talking about Vikings and Packers, and that's kind of why I stopped. Or I started disliking the Green Bay Packers because of their fans. They were just so crazy. Were you went to a Minnesota school? Were people talking about it? Like, did people really like the Vikings? Like, was everybody a football fan because you were in the heart of St. Paul?
it. Yeah, indeed, yes, very
Okay.
much so. And we didn't have to worry about Packer fans harassing us in school because there was none.
None?
It wasn't. No, it's not like um, you being a Viking fan growing up in Wisconsin and being harassed by Packer fans when you went to school. That didn't happen. And when I say harassed, of course, it's all in good fun, um, mostly. So the Viking Packer rivalry, though, even though I lived in Minnesota, was still a big deal. And in the 1973 season, the Vikings played the Packers in week number 3, and this was a hard hitting game. Andrew, the Vikings were 2-0. I think the Packers came in; they were 1-1, and there was no touchdowns in that game. The Vikings got a safety early, um, and I think and then they got a field goal. The Packers got a field goal, and at halftime it was 5-3. That's a baseball score, but that was the score at halftime, 5-3 in favor of the Vikings. The Vikings went on and got a couple more field goals and won the game 11-3. Nowadays, Andrew, you don't see many games that are 11-3 for a final score. Well, 11 is kind of a weird number anyway, but for football. But in games in the 70s, there wasn't a lot of touchdowns all the time. There was just good, solid defense.
So, quick quiz question, and then I'm gonna go into my next question. So there's 14 games. The final record was 12-2. Do you remember? Yeah, their final regular season record was 12-2, and they were number one in their division, NFC North. Do you remember the two games or the two teams that they lost to?
Yeah, very, very much so. And there's a story behind each one of them. So I'll jump right into it. The Vikings rolled along after they beat the Packers. They improved to 6-0 after 6 weeks, and in week number 7 they played the Los Angeles Rams, and that game was in Minnesota. And both teams, Andrew, were undefeated. The Rams were 6-0, the Vikings were 6-0, and this was a hard-hitting game. And the Vikings defense played about as best as they could. Chuck Foreman got a touchdown. It was the only touchdown of the game. Fred Cox got a field goal. The Rams had three field goals in the game. The final score was 10-9, and man, I mean, you can't get any closer than that. The Vikings were the only undefeated team after 7 weeks. They were 7-0 and had won the same amount of games that they had done in the previous year when they were 7-7. And they rolled along, Andrew. They won the next week against Cleveland, and then in week number 9 they beat the Lions. They were 9-0, and they had already clinched the NFC Central Division after 9 weeks, which I think might have been one of the earliest time a team has clinched their division with still 5 weeks to go.
So week 9, Atlanta Falcons.
Week 10. The Vikings were 9-0, and
9-0.
on Monday Night Football, they met the Atlanta Falcons. And this game was interesting, Andrew, because the quarterback for the Falcons was Bob Lee, who used to be a backup quarterback for the Vikings in 1969, 70, and 71. Might have even been in 72. I think he was, now that I think about it. And the Vikings let him go. The Falcons picked him up, and he had a phenomenal year for the Falcons. I don't think he got them to the playoffs, but I think they had a really good record. They were on a 6-game winning streak of their own. They weren't undefeated, but they were out to end the 9-0 winning streak of the Vikings by beating them on Monday Night Football, which they did. Bob Lee had a wonderful game, and the Falcons won 20-16, and the Vikings had their first loss of the season.
So you, as a kid watching that, were you pretty devastated with that loss?
Yeah, I can remember the next day at school, one of my buddies, Louis Biaggi. He was upset, and he said the Vikings were mad at each other because they lost the game, and I don't know if that was true or not, but yeah, we were just all mad at each other because we weren't mad at each other, but we were just mad because the Vikings lost and they weren't undefeated anymore, because we wanted to see the Vikings go undefeated like the Dolphins did the previous year and win the Super Bowl. But the Vikings had already clinched the playoff spot. So now the last 4 games was just to see how good a record they could finish with. And the following week, they did beat, I believe, the Lions, so they went 10-1. And
it was the Bears. It was the Bears Thanksgiving Day, maybe.
Nope, they didn't play on Thanksgiving Day that year because they had the previous year. But you're right, they beat the Bears, and then they played the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, the Vikings had never, ever played Cincinnati up until that point. Cincinnati was an expansion team in the mid-'60s in the old AFL, and the Vikings had never played Cincinnati. This was the first time they had ever played the Cincinnati Bengals, and they did it on the road at old Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati. And I can remember a pro wrestler. Matter of fact, we talked about this pro wrestler last week, superstar Billy Graham. He came on the air being interviewed by Marty O'Neill, and he said, The Vikings think they're so great. Well, I tell you, I'm friends with a so and so on the Cincinnati Bengals. I don't remember who the player was. And he said, I guarantee the Cincinnati Bengals will beat the mighty Vikings 27-0, Daddy. And the Vikings aren't so great. Cincinnati's going to beat them. Well, lo and behold, Cincinnati beat the Vikings 27-0.
Yeah.
And I remember that to this day, Andrew. Superstar Billy Graham, a pro wrestler, saying that, and I don't remember who his friend was on the Bengals, but the Vikings did go on to win their final two games and finished 12-2, and they were ready for the playoffs.
So they Bengals beat them, but in the next 2 weeks they beat the Packers, they beat the Giants. Regular season is over. They're 12-2. Everybody's comfortable because they know they're in the playoffs. So let's start talking about the playoffs. Before we start the games, how excited are you as a kid knowing that from what was to now, 1973 into 1974, the Vikings are leading, they're on top. Pretty excited that they're probably going to go all the way, right?
Well, yeah, it was very exciting because this was my first time seeing the Vikings in the playoffs because I wasn't really interested in football in 1971, the last time they made the playoffs. Of course, I mentioned earlier in '72 is when I first really started watching it and keeping track of things. Um, so in 1973, they're in the playoffs against the Washington Redskins, and it's a home game at Metropolitan Stadium. And yeah, I'm just excited. The Vikings are 12-2. The only other team that was 12-2 was the Los Angeles Rams, who the Vikings beat. So I'm thinking at some point they're going to meet the Rams in the playoffs and have a rematch. And of course, over in the AFC, the Miami Dolphins, the defending champions, they finished the season 11-3, and they're looking at getting back to the Super Bowl and winning another one. So yeah, there was a lot of intrigue, and it was just exciting for that first playoff game in December on a Saturday afternoon in Bloomington, Minnesota.
So yeah, I for some reason I thought it was only 4 weeks, 14 weeks. I thought it was into January. But as you mentioned, they beat the Redskins. Next week, conference championships, they beat the other contender, which was the Dallas Cowboys. Are you able to watch these games?
Yes.
Okay.
Um,
Right.
Again, that same rule applied that we talked about earlier, that since the Vikings made the playoffs, that means tickets went on sale um, on Monday morning, and they had to be sold out again 72 hours prior to kickoff, which was on a Saturday. So that means that the game had to be sold out, oh, you figure by Wednesday at noon. And I think Pillsbury, if I'm not mistaken, Pillsbury, who of course is a major company, they make cookies and cereals and all that stuff. I think they bought out what tickets hadn't been sold by Wednesday at noon to make sure that the game was on TV. And then Pillsbury just gave the tickets they bought to their employees, and they were a big factory, so they had thousands of employees. So that's how the Vikings were on TV for that playoff game. And
Well,
go ahead, Andrew.
and let's just jump right into it. Super Bowl eight. It's on paper my favorite Super Bowl. Maybe I should try to find the whole thing and watch it on YouTube because I've always been a Dolphins fan. Obviously, grew up in the Midwest. I'm a Vikings fan. Even when I was in Wisconsin, I was a Dolphins fan. So Vikings, Dolphins, the two best teams. Not like a team that kind of snuck in. Like these were the best NFC, best AFC teams at the time. What's going on with the culture around St. Paul? Is there merchandise everywhere? Is there like flags hung up in the road? Is everybody excited in school? Like Vikings are going to the Super Bowl. What's happening?
Right. Right. Well, in I just want to talk about the playoff games just a little bit because in that Redskin game, the first game, they were losing. The Vikings were losing 7-3 at halftime, and Minnesota defensive lineman Carl Eller, who's in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, broke a blackboard because instead of the coaches giving the halftime rah rah speech, um, Carl Eller got up and he was ticked off because the Vikings were losing at halftime, and the Vikings hadn't been to the Super Bowl in 4 years, and they wanted to get back there, Andrew. So the defense, the famous Viking defense, the Purple People leaders, they wanted to get back to the Super Bowl. And Carl Eller, who was one of the leaders of that defense, got up and started yelling and using profanity probably, and said, we got to play better. We got to quit making mistakes. We want to get back to the Super Bowl. We didn't even make the playoffs in 72. In 70 and 71, we lost in the first round. We got to beat the Redskins. We got to get to the Super Bowl. And so the Vikings came out, and a running back named Oscar Reed had this beautiful run of 50 yards to start the second half. The Vikings scored, and they were on their way. They beat the Redskins 27-20 to earn the right to go down to Dallas, who had upset the Rams. Remember, I told you, Andrew, the Rams were 12-2, and Dallas upset the Rams in the other playoff game. And so it was the Vikings against Dallas. And Dallas also always a very tough team. They had been in the Super Bowl a couple of times in 71 and 72. I'm sorry, 70 and 71. So a formidable team, and the Vikings went down there, played probably their best game of the year, and Fran Tarkenton was absolutely phenomenal. He called the game. Nowadays, Andrew, the plays are run in from the coaches on the sidelines, but back then the quarterbacks called their own plays. They didn't have a little transmitter in their helmet to find out what the next play was going to be, or somebody didn't run it in from the sidelines. Back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, early 80s, quarterbacks called their own game, and Fran Tarkenton called a beautiful game, and they beat Dallas 27-10 to go to that Super Bowl that you're anxiously waiting to talk about.
So, shout out to our boy Fred Cox that we talked about a few weeks ago with the Nerf football. He was like they definitely relied on this guy during this game. Just real quick, when you're watching the Redskins and Cowboys these playoff games, were you worried or hesitant, or were you pretty confident as a Vikings fan because you just knew they were so good?
The Redskin game, I was really worried
Okay.
because I thought, here we go again. I mean, I had heard about um, the debacles in 70 and 71, how San Francisco came up in 1970 and beat the Vikings. And then in 71, the Cowboys came up to Minnesota. And the Vikings are supposed to have home field advantage because, temperatures are in single digits, in December. And these warm weather teams, San Francisco one year and Dallas the next year, come up to Minnesota and beat the Vikings, and then in 72 they didn't make the playoffs at all. So yeah, I was worried. I wanted to see this team go to the Super Bowl, and so they got by the Redskins. Totally relieved by that. And then I was terrified of them going down to Dallas, and because back then it wasn't necessarily the best record that had home field advantage. So Dallas, for whatever reason, had home field that day, but it didn't matter. The Vikings played probably their best game of the season, beating the Cowboys and earning the right to go to Super Bowl VIII at Rice University in Houston, Texas, the one and only time the Super Bowl has been at Rice University in Houston, and that's a good thing.
I think I don't know, maybe I wasn't in that stadium when I lived in Houston, but, we're just gonna say, like, it's the facts, like, everybody knows the Dolphins won. Like, they were, like, undefeated, like, they were really good, Super Bowl VII, Super Bowl VIII, they defeated the Vikings, they won 24-7. But that's not the point of this podcast to just read stats. I asked you, what was the culture of Minnesota? What was it in school leading up to the Super Bowl, before that day, during the game, and after the game? Tell me what was going on in your mind, 1973.
Yeah, it was a long 2 weeks, Andrew, because after they beat Dallas, it was a 2 week wait for the Super Bowl. Well, much like nowadays, there's still, after the NFC Championship and AFC Championship, there's a 2 week wait before the Super Bowl. And that was a long 2 weeks, Andrew. But yeah, we talked about it every day at school. I went to Adams Elementary in St. Paul, and it was a wonderful time because we all tried to go outside and play football, even though it was cold in January and there was deep snow. But we were just excited. We all impersonated our favorite Viking players. I used to do Chuck Foreman's spin moves, and other kids, were Fran Tarkington throwing the ball and John Gilliam catching the ball, or Carl Eller tackling people. I mean, we all had our favorite players, and there was just a buzz all over the school. There was a buzz all over the Twin Cities. You would see signs, go Vikes, and beat them Dolphins. And the Dolphins were favored by 9, if I remember right, going into that Super Bowl. I mean, they were about as good a football team as you could have during that time, Andrew, with Larry Zonka, Jim Kick, and Mercury Morris as running backs, Paul Warfield as a receiver, Bob Greasy, the quarterback, their no-name defense. I mean, the Vikings were in for a tough game, and they knew that. And like you mentioned, it really wasn't much of a game because Miami went up 14-0, like right now, right away in the first quarter. Vikings did get a garbage touchdown, I guess you could say, in the late in the game to avoid being shut out. But that game was over at halftime. But the the Vikings weren't expected to win, so the fact that they lost the Super Bowl wasn't a huge disappointment to me. Like the following year when they lost to Pittsburgh in Super Bowl 9. Um, so there was a lot of buzz. It was a lot of fun, but after the Vikings were so dominant through much of the year, we were excited for the following season, 1974.
Before we wrap it up, I'm gonna just ask real quick. So you're watching Super Bowl, you're watching your guy, Chuck Foreman, the spin doctor. So that didn't work out. The Pro Bowl was afterwards. Were any of the Vikings in the Pro Bowl, like after the Super Bowl, or was that not a thing that the Super Bowl teams played?
Yes, they did, Andrew, which was that's a great question because nowadays the Pro Bowl is before the Super Bowl, so the Super Bowl teams don't have to be represented at the Pro Bowl. Not that any of them would want to risk getting hurt anyway, but back then the Pro Bowl was after the Super Bowl. So yeah, there were several Vikings in the Pro Bowl: Fran Tarkington, John Gilliam, Chuck Foreman. And one interesting thing that I remember about that, Andrew, is Bud Grant, the coach of the Vikings, would never allow his team to wear anything other than black shoes. They always wore black shoes, and that was just a Bud Grant thing. It was a traditional thing. Other teams were wearing white shoes and looked cool. They looked faster because they had white shoes on, but the Vikings had to wear black shoes. So in the Pro Bowl, Chuck Foreman didn't have to wear black shoes, and he wore a pair of white shoes, and he just looked cool. He looked cool in white shoes, running up and down the field, and it was just fun to watch. My favorite running back wearing white shoes instead of the traditional black shoes.
So I swear I got two questions and I'm done here. Do you remember any really cool merch or people decorating outside or anything that stands out to you that people were doing in the city or in the state?
Well, there wasn't a lot of that. I mean, I can remember on the news you could see like downtown Minneapolis, like maybe the IDS tower or something would have purple lights on or something. But back in the 70s, there wasn't a lot of decorations. You would see some signs here and there, like "Go Vikes," "Good luck, Super Bowl 8," and people would make signs and greet players at the airport and stuff. But yeah, it's not like today, Andrew. No.
No parades or anything?
Well, not if they would have won the Super Bowl. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, there would have been a parade. But no, not prior. No, not prior to the game.
Okay, so is there anything you want to say, last question, about like the 1973 season or watching the playoffs or the Super Bowl that just like meant a lot to you that you still remember to this day that you want to share?
1973 was just a really fun time. We were living in a different neighborhood, a different house, and everything was new, a different school. And there was a buzz about the Vikings all the time. And my brother and I were outside playing football, and we were doing pickup football games with neighborhood kids. And, it was just a lot of fun. We were all big Viking fans, and you didn't bother anybody at noon. Actually, maybe 1 o'clock. I think games were on at 1 o'clock on Sunday. Um, I don't remember that for sure, but I think they were. So you didn't bother anybody, or you didn't bother any of your friends to play a pickup football game between 1 and 4 on a Sunday afternoon. You waited until afterwards to go out and play football.
Were
So
you
yeah, 1973 was just a great.
were you playing in the snow?
Oh gosh, yes.
Okay,
Playing
okay.
in the snow was a great time. I mean, watching players actually do that in an NFL game, slipping and sliding in a frozen field. Man, you had to go out and do that yourself because that was a blast.
Well, we hope you had a great time listening to this episode. We're thankful that you listen, and you listen every week on YouTube. And it sounds like Brian was thankful for the 1973 Viking season that he still remembers to this day. Peace out from Andrew. Brian, any final words?
Peace, my friends. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
All right, thank you. This is Andrew Lockhart here once again to talk about GodTheFatherApparel.com. GodTheFatherApparel.com/Andrew-Lockhart. Type in right now in the URL bar, or if you're watching or listening to this on YouTube, go into the description and click on the link. I'm going to do it right now with you. And click on the link, and GodTheFather.com/Andrew-Lockhart. You might have to type it in, but you go to GodTheFather.com, and you just see all the different designs, t-shirts, and hoodies that were created by Drew. Drew wanted to express his faith, express his Christianity, but you can't just go out there and yell at people or try to convert them. And a good way to strike up a conversation, in his words, is by a cool looking t-shirt. I'm going to look real quick, just for examples, bestsellers, tees, hoodies, hats. You have the bleach tie-dye one. You have the choose prayer over panic, God with her, different his plan over mine. Really unique designs and colors and Bible verses. And you can find all this at GodTheFather.com, and go today to GodTheFather.com/Andrew-Lockhart. And when you're at checkout, you can type in Lockhart15, that's my last name, LOCKHART 15, Lockhart 15, to get 15 or sometimes 20% off. It depends. One more time, that's GodTheFather.com, and they're also doing a free thing until the end of, what month is this? September. Wow, a free thing. If you don't want to use the Lockhart code, you can type in free shipping for free shipping off your order this week only. So until the end of September, I believe they're stretching into. So you can rather use Lockhart 15 for 15% off, or if you want to do free shipping, type in the word free shipping, no space, free shipping, and you get free shipping off your order until the end of September. GodTheFather.com, GodTheFatherApparel.com, excuse me. Wear today, strike up a conversation, and show the world your faith. That's GodTheFatherApparel.com.